Hey folks, you're looking at a 1982 London Roadster, which is modeled after a 49 MG TD, I believe. This vehicle belongs to a buddy of mine. I bought it recently, and since it's 2016, at the time of this filming, the car's about 40 years old and hasn't had a lot of maintenance done to it. So it's based upon a Volkswagen air-cooled four-cylinder mounted in the back, and front suspension is rack and pinion. I believe it's off of like a 81 Chevette, possibly something like that. I think it was a Chevy model. It's strut suspension with the rack and pinion steering, but the rest of it, the drivetrain, is all Volkswagen. And there's a common problem with Volkswagens in that there's a thing called the shift rod bushing that wears out. And the shift rod bushing looks like this. This is the guy here. This is the kit that the replacement part came in. Okay, so you've got a bracket that would mount underneath the vehicle, front facing up like this. Shift rod bushing goes into it, snaps inside of there. This snap ring goes around it as well and on the front side of it. And you grease it all up, and that whole assembly is designed to support the shift rod. And the shift rod is this guy right here. This is the shift rod. Your stick shift goes into here, mounts in that cup, held in place by two bolts right here, 13 millimeter bolts, and your shifter goes back and forth through the gears. The rod is disconnected from the transmission at the moment. The rod sits in here. I'll show you light back here. There's an inspection plate on this Roadster I took off. Mounts here, and it gives you access to a second coupling in the back that goes to the transmission. So this goes in here. There's an assembly that goes through the side with I imagine these were rubber as opposed to urethane. They're so old they're very stiff and they've shrunk, so they'll need to be replaced as well. So once you disassemble this, the shift rod moves freely. And that bushing that I mentioned earlier is supposed to mount right in here. This is the bracket that I showed you earlier. It's upside down in this contraption because this is kind of a custom one-off. It's not a Volkswagen setup, but the bushing goes inside of the hole and it surrounds the shift rod with the intention of taking up any lateral play you have in there. This, you can see the light around that shift rod. That's supposed to be nice and snug, so that when you're shifting through the gears, you don't have any free play in here. It should be nice and snug. And when that bushing goes, your shifts get very sloppy. You might be, grinding a few gears trying to make this thing shift. It's a real pain in the neck. So in order to replace it, in a Volkswagen, you would have to remove the shift rod, and there's plenty of YouTube videos on there to do that. And the shift rod, you disconnect it in the back here. This is a shortened shift rod, by the way, too, for this application. They took a Volkswagen shift rod, cut it down, and welded it so it's a lot shorter. But the deal is that in order to replace the bushing up in here, the shift rod bushing, you disconnect the back end of this thing, you take off some cover place in the front, and you slide the shift rod out. You got to take it completely out of this bracket in order to pop in the replacement bushing. And then you take the shift rod, you feed it in from the front again, grease it up, and put your assembly back together. But in this, London Motors replica, 49 MG replica, this isn't made to be serviceable, and it's a plastic bushing that wears out every few years. But they welded this whole thing up tight. The bracket which would normally be tack welded, you could easily get off and hold in with bolts in a Volkswagen. They welded it to this whole top faceplate, and then there's a box, steel box around it. Everything's welded together, and the box at the bottom onto the frame is welded. Nothing comes apart. The front of this assembly also, it's solid steel, so that shift rod can't come out. This cannot be disassembled, which basically means it's not serviceable at all. I can't get that bushing in. Now the bushing is split, so I tried putting the bushing on the rod and see if I could force it through, but it's just such a snug fit, it's not going. So now it's time to go to plan B and jury rig something that's going to act as a shift rod bushing in there, take up that gap, yet still allow the shift rod to function properly, but take up the clearances in there. And I'm trying to think of how I'm going to do that, and we'll get back to you in plan 2. Okay, you London Roadster fans, part 2, shift rod bushing replacement. And we're looking at the replacement part here. So I'm assuming this is representative of what's in the car. If they're, the aftermarket is just using the same specs on the original, everything should be pretty similar. So first thing I want to do is get an idea of what I'm looking at for an ID in this hole. Okay, so that's coming in at about 1 inch and 25. That's a little bit less than 1 inch and a 32nd. Hold on, let me see here. Yeah, just about 1 inch and a 32nd of an inch. So I'm scrounging around the house, seeing what I can come up with that'll work for this. Ideally, if you want to spend the time and the money, if you go to a machine shop and give them the outside diameter for the bracket, and you give them the outside diameter of the rod, they may be able to make you a custom bushing out of something like bronze. You could even, I'm thinking you could do this as a split bushing. If you had a piece of, even if there was a piece of copper pipe that had the diameter that would fit inside of this bracket, 1 inch 0.25 for an OD on the copper pipe, you turned it down, and then you bored out the inside of the pipe to slip over this guy. You could feed it in from the back, feed that sleeve all the way up here, extend it in past the bushing, and put a hose clamp on it on the back just to keep that bushing in place on the shift rod. Now you've taken up the gap that's in there between the bracket and the shift rod, and it should last pretty good and not rust. The original part was plastic, and plastic is going to wear, but it's also it's not going to squeak. So a quick jury rig solution also would be to maybe take some aluminum flashing, thin diameter flashing, and wrap it around this shift rod 2 or 3 times until it fills up the gap. Feed it in past the bracket and start wrapping it around until it builds up in diameter and fits in there snugly. And then once again, put a hose clamp on here, and you could do the same in the other end too. Move the shift rod down, put a hose clamp in the front, and you keep that shim stock from moving around, and it takes up the gap. Kind of jury rig. Best bet would be go to a machine shop and have them craft something for you a little more permanent out of bronze. So, but I'm looking for something that may be around handy in my home that I can put this together and have it run reasonably well. So knowing that I have a diameter of 1 25/1000 on the ID of the shift rod bracket, I said, let me see what I got around for plastic parts. And I said, I got some plumbing stuff laying around here. So let me see what we got here on the threaded diameter. Huh, pretty darn close, isn't it? 1" 30" on the OD of the threads, which is good because that's a little bit of a snug fit. So I can probably jam this into the bracket hole and start threading it. It's going to self-thread itself right into that rod and lock itself in place. And it's plastic, so it won't rust and it won't make a squeaking noise. Now the only thing I have to do is get the ID of this thing pretty close to the shift rod, and I might have a solution. And I can take this and feed this into the back of the shift rod where it connects to the transmission and bring it up, and then start threading it into the shift rod bracket. So I need to validate what I got for a diameter on the shift rod, and we can do that. I can get the light fixed here. I'm going to have to take my word for it. Okay. And we have 865 thousandths of an inch. So, just a little bit under 7/8, 865. If it had a 7/8 inch drill or end mill, something that would make a 7/8 of an inch hole, that would probably be close enough. You'd just have a little bit of slop in there, but just enough. It won't be bad. So that's what I'm going to try and do now, see what I have around that I can open up this ID with and bring it up to about 7/8 of an inch, and we'll get back to you. Bushing has been opened up in the internal diameter. Now, I'll just give you a quick rundown of how I did that. You need a 7/8 inch drill bit, or what I have here is a step bushing, which goes up to 7/8 of an inch, and it's made for sheet metal, but it worked okay. The thing is, it had a taper on it, so you can't use like a Forstner bit or a woodworking bit that doesn't have a tapered nose on it. Like most drill bits are 118 degree including angle taper, because if you have an existing hole in there, you have to have that thing grip evenly on the sides. If it has nothing to guide it, it's just gonna get butchered up. So this will find the center of the existing hole okay. And I used an open-end wrench to grab it on the facets to hold it, as opposed to putting it in a vise. If you put it in something vice grips and you squeeze this, because it's plastic, you're going to deform it. And the hole that you drill when you take the vice grips off, it's going to be egg-shaped. So I used open-end wrench just to grab the facets and hold it steady without squeezing it, and I backed it up by something that would just give it some support when I'm forcing the drill in laterally this direction. So it backs this up. The wrench was on the facets to keep it from spinning, because what happens is the drill is going to go past the end of this guy. So you need something with a hole in it, like a socket, so the drill has a place to go and you can clear the hole out nicely. So this is measuring 1 7/8 now, just a wee bit over maybe. Let's check it out again. That's pretty close. 1 inch 875. That's providing about 10 thousandths of an inch clearance between the shaft. The shaft was coming in at 1 inch 865. But that could be a good thing. There's two reasons for that. Number one, I can get a little grease around the shaft, so this will have a little bit of grease between it and the shaft to help slow down any wear. And a second reason is that this being plastic is probably going to shrink when it gets cold out. And if you make the thing too tight, once you get some cold weather, it might really grab that shaft a little too tightly. And also when I force this into the hanger bracket, those threads may squeeze down on the shaft a little bit too, because there's going to be a little bit of an interference fit in there. The threads will give, and they'll have something to engage in that bracket, especially nicely because the bracket's probably only about a 1/16 of an inch thick sheet metal. Take a look at it here. Here's the bracket once again. Okay, So this guy's going to be going in, and you're going to have a little bit of an interference, but because that bracket is thin sheet metal, it's almost going to fit in there between the threads. I think it's going to give the threads something to hold on to. If this was very thick, it would just mash the threads. But this is going to deform the threads, and it's going to have them someplace to go, so this won't pop out once it's in there. That's how it is in theory. We'll see how it goes. Stay tuned. I just discovered something in trying to install that bushing from the backside of the shift rod. This was shortened by the kit card manufacturer, London Roadster, and the way they did it, they cut the thing in half, took out a section in the middle, and they welded it back together. So this weld is actually a little bit bigger, so it's probably added a 64th of an inch in the diameter, and it's uneven all the way across. So I've got two options. I can either try grinding this off all the way around, which is a pain in the ass because it's still in the car and I can't get it out of there, or I can split the bushing. So I'm just going to take a hacksaw and I'm going to go laterally down that whole bushing so that it will expand in its internal diameter, and I can get it over this guy. Okie dokie. We have our bushing. If you can see it, I got a saw cut down it with a hacksaw. That's it. Nothing fancy. So this should allow it to expand and get over that weld. Okay, let me see that. Yep, there she goes. Okay, that will go up and we'll thread it in. We have the bushing installed, and having it split in it means it was a little bit looser than I would have initially liked putting it in, but it did go in there reasonably well. If you can see there's a flange on one side of that bushing, which makes it a good candidate to use. There's other plumbing stuff you can use, but this had a flange. The side forward had the threads, which was a smaller diameter, so basically this can't go in that direction anymore because it's going to hit the housing. And just as a backup, in case the engagement with the threads to the housing failed, I've used some mechanics wire to wrap around that thread, so this thing shouldn't pop back out. It's a little bit hillbilly fixing, but you know what, the fitting cost 50 cents, and all you had to do is drill it out to 7/8, so it's a cheap fix, and it's probably gonna last a long time, especially in a vehicle that doesn't get used as a daily driver. It does the trick, and short of going to a machine shop and doing some real radical repair work, it's going to get this car back on the road. Good luck.